What if history's darkest secrets were hidden in plain sight? In this video, we uncover 60 haunting photos from the Nazi Holocaust that reveal the chilling reality of one of humanity's darkest chapters. You won't believe what you're about to see. Let's begin. 1941 Einsatzgruppen massacres. From 1941, Nazi Einsatzgruppen executed mass shootings of Jews, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war across Eastern Europe. 1942, the Holocaust's systematic expansion. In 1942, Nazi Germany constructed death camps like Auschwitz, where millions were murdered in the name of the final solution. 1941, the Siege of Leningrad. Between 1941 to 1944, the Nazis laid siege to Leningrad, causing a devastating famine that killed over 1 million Soviet civilians. 1943, the massacre at Babi Yar. In September 1941, Nazi forces murdered 33,000 Jews in Babi Yar, Ukraine, in one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. 1944, Auschwitz liberation. In January 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz, revealing the full scale of Nazi atrocities, including gas chambers and mass executions. 1943, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In April-May 1943, the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto mounted a heroic but doomed uprising against the Nazis. 1942, Treblinka gas chambers. By 1942, Nazi Germany perfected the use of gas chambers in Treblinka, where over 900,000 Jews were murdered. 1940, the T4 euthanasia program. Starting in 1940, Nazi Germany initiated the T4 program, murdering tens of thousands of disabled individuals under the guise of mercy killings. 1941, the Roma genocide. From 1941 to 1942, Nazi Germany systematically exterminated Roma people as part of their genocidal policies. What harrowing truths lie behind the mass deportations that changed countless lives? Let's watch. 1943, mass deportations to death camps. In 1943, Nazis began large-scale deportations of Jews from ghettos across Europe to concentration and extermination camps like Auschwitz. 1942, Battle of Stalingrad and its aftermath. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, led to severe civilian casualties, including mass executions, famine, and bombardment by Nazi forces. 1943, resistance movements in Europe. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements fought against Nazi occupation despite overwhelming odds and Nazi retaliation. 1945, Nuremberg trials. After the war, Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials, bringing attention to the systematic nature of their atrocities. 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto. In 1940, the Nazis began the construction of the Warsaw Ghetto, where Jews were forcibly confined under horrific conditions. 1941, Operation Barbarossa. In 1941, Hitler's Operation Barbarossa launched the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, leading to millions of deaths among Soviet civilians and prisoners. 1942, Nazi occupation of Paris. In 1942, the Nazis occupied Paris, establishing a regime of terror against Jews and other marginalized groups. 1941, the execution of the intelligentsia in Poland. During 1941, Nazi forces executed thousands of Polish intellectuals and activists in an effort to eliminate any resistance to Nazi occupation. What drove Nazi soldiers to commit one of the most horrifying massacres of World War II in a quiet French village? Let's watch. 1944, the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane. On June 10, 1944, Nazi soldiers massacred 642 civilians in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane as part of a brutal crackdown. 1941, the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. In November 1938, Nazis initiated the Kristallnacht, where synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, and thousands arrested. 1942, the beginning of the final solution. In 1942, Nazi officials formally adopted the final solution, marking the start of mass extermination in concentration camps. 1943, deportation from the Theresienstadt ghetto. In 1943, Jews were deported from the Theresienstadt ghetto to extermination camps, marking the end of the so-called model ghetto. 1940, the first concentration camps. By 1940, Nazi Germany had established its first concentration camps, where political opponents and Jews were subjected to brutal forced labor. Nazi Holocaust stories have drastic spirit in them, so don't forget to subscribe Timeless Frames to watch more videos like this. 1941, the execution of Soviet prisoners of war. In 1941, the Nazis executed hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war, leaving their bodies scattered across Eastern Europe. 1942, mass executions in the East. From 1942 onward, mass executions in occupied Eastern Europe became a key part of the Nazi strategy to eliminate Jews and Slavs. 1945, the liberation of concentration camps. As Allied forces advanced in 1945, they liberated numerous concentration camps, revealing the full horror of Nazi genocide. 1943, the Battle of Kursk and Nazi retreat. After the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Nazis suffered a decisive defeat, marking the beginning of their retreat from Eastern Europe. 1940, Nazi expansion across Europe. In 1940, the Nazis had expanded their control over much of Europe, including France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, beginning their brutal occupation. 1943, the death marches. As the Allies advanced, Nazis forced prisoners to march to different camps, causing the deaths of thousands from exhaustion and brutality. 1942, the deportation of French Jews. In 1942, Nazis began the mass deportation of Jews from France to concentration camps like Auschwitz. 1944, the mass execution at the Płaszów camp. In 1944, Nazi forces executed thousands of Jews and Roma at the Płaszów labor camp in Poland. 1941, the death of the Warsaw ghetto leader, Mordecai Anielewicz. In 1943, Mordecai Anielewicz, leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, died fighting against the Nazis, what led to the obliteration of an entire village in Czechoslovakia, leaving Lidice as a chilling symbol of Nazi vengeance. Let's watch. 1942, Massacre at Lidice, Czechoslovakia. In June 1942, Nazis massacred the entire population of Lidice, Czechoslovakia, as revenge for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. 1944, the Battle of Normandy, D-Day. In June 1944, Allied forces launched the D-Day invasion, signaling the beginning of the end for Nazi control in Europe. 1940, the Massacre of the Katyn Forest. In 1940, over 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals were executed by Soviet forces under Nazi supervision in the Katyn Forest. 1942, the beginning of forced labor in Nazi camps. By 1942, the Nazis implemented forced labor across their occupied territories, exploiting millions of people in horrific conditions. 1941, the massacre at Kamieniec-Podolsk. In 1941, Nazi troops executed over 23,000 Jews in the Ukrainian city of Kamieniec-Podolsk during Operation Barbarossa. 1943, the mass execution at Sobibor. In 1943, Nazi forces executed over 250,000 Jews at the Sobibor extermination camp in Poland. 1942, mass executions at Chelmno. In 1942, Chelmno became one of the first Nazi extermination camps where over 200,000 Jews and Romani people were killed. 1944, the execution of the Dutch resistance. In 1944, several members of the Dutch resistance were executed by the Nazis for their role in fighting against occupation. What was the horrifying plan that marked one of the deadliest phases of the Holocaust? Let's see. 1942, the beginning of Operation Reinhard. In 1942, Nazi Germany initiated Operation Reinhard, the systematic murder of over 2 million Jews in extermination camps. 1944, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising ends. In May 1944, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was crushed by Nazi forces, resulting in the death of many resistance fighters and civilians. 1941, Nazi massacre of Jews in Jasenovac. In 1941, the Jasenovac concentration camp in Yugoslavia became a site for mass executions of Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. 1942, the secret Nazi plans for the Holocaust. In 1942, Nazi officials held the Wannsee Conference, where they formalized plans for the complete extermination of Jews in Europe. 1944, execution of Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz. In 1944, as Allied forces neared, Nazi authorities executed thousands of Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz to hide evidence of their crimes. What happened to the vibrant community of the Vilna Ghetto? Let's watch 1944, the destruction of the Vilna Ghetto. In 1944, Nazi forces destroyed the Vilna Ghetto, executing thousands of Jews and deporting the remaining population to concentration camps. 1941, the starvation of Leningrad. In 1941, Nazi forces began a brutal siege of Leningrad, which led to widespread starvation, killing over 1 million people. 1940, mass deportations from Belgium. In 1940, the Nazis began rounding up Jews and political dissidents in Belgium for forced labor camps or deportations to extermination camps. 1943, the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. In June 1944, Nazi soldiers executed 642 civilians in Oradour-sur-Glane, France, in retaliation for the French resistance. What was the devastating impact of Nazi forces when they unleashed Operation Barbarossa? Let's watch. 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Nazi forces launched Operation Barbarossa, a brutal invasion of the Soviet Union that led to millions of civilian deaths. 1942, the first gassing at Auschwitz. In 1942, Nazi officials began gassing Jews in Auschwitz, marking the beginning of the use of gas chambers for mass murder. 1941, the killing fields of Eastern Europe. By 1941, Nazi troops had established killing fields in Eastern Europe, where Jews, Roma, and other minorities were systematically murdered. 1945, the liberation of Dachau. In April 1945, Allied forces liberated Dachau, one of the first concentration camps to be freed, exposing the full scope of Nazi atrocities. 1940, the execution of Polish elites. In 1940, Nazis executed 22,000 Polish intellectuals and leaders in the Katyn forest, part of their plan to destroy Polish resistance. 1941, the killing of Jews in Lviv. In 1941, Nazi forces and their collaborators murdered over 15,000 Jews in Lviv, Ukraine, as part of their campaign of mass executions. 1942, Operation Torch in North Africa. In 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, a series of landings in North Africa that marked a turning point in the war against Nazi forces. 1940, Nazi occupation of Denmark. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark, marking the start of their occupation of Scandinavian countries during World War II. 1944, the assassination attempt on Hitler. In July 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler in the failed Operation Valkyrie plot. 1941, the destruction of the Babi Yar Memorial. In 1943, the Nazis destroyed the Babi Yar Memorial to erase traces of the massacre of over 33,000 Jews. Thanks for watching this video. To see more videos like this, subscribe to the Timeless Frames channel. See you in the next video. Goodbye, guys.